clock on the wall had stopped. 3:33 a.m., frozen in time, the second hand trembling, but never moving forward. And that's when I heard it, that sound that shouldn't exist, someone breathing, deep, rhythmic, deliberate, behind the wall. But no, that's not where this story begins. This one starts differently, under a bright November sky, inside a small hardware store that smelled of oil and sawdust, in a town so quiet you could hear conversations from 3 blocks away. Plainfield, Wisconsin, population 642, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, where children played in the streets until dark without fear. November 16th, 1957, a Saturday morning. A bell chimes as the door opens. Cold air rushes in, carrying the scent of approaching winter. A woman stands behind the counter, organizing receipts. She's 58 years old, silver hair pinned back neatly, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Bernice Worden. She owns this store, has run it for years. Honest, hard-working, beloved by the community. She glances up, smiling at a customer examining antifreeze on the shelf. The man is thin, unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing work clothes and a faded jacket. She's seen him before. Ed something. Ed Gein. He comes in occasionally, buys supplies, always polite, always pays in cash. She writes out his receipt, her handwriting neat and careful. The door chimes again as he leaves. Bernice continues her work. Outside, frost clings to the windows. The street is empty, the town quiet. And then she's gone. When Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden arrived at his mother's hardware store that evening, around 5 p.m., he found the door unlocked. That was the first strange thing. His mother never left the door unlocked when she closed up. He pushed it open. The bell chimed. The sound echoed through the empty store. Mom? Nothing. The lights were on. The register open, overturned. Money scattered across the counter. And then he saw it. Blood. A dark stain on the wooden floor. Still wet. Still fresh. Drag marks leading toward the back door. Frank's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. His heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth went dry. Mom. The store remained silent. He moved through the aisles, past shelves of tools and paint cans, past the office in the back. Empty. His mother was gone, but something caught his eye. A receipt on the counter, the last one she'd written. 1 gallon of antifreeze, made out to Ed Gein. Frank felt ice crawl up his spine. He knew Ed. Everyone did. Odd fellow. Kept to himself. Lived alone on that old farm outside of town. Frank grabbed the receipt, ran to his patrol car. The radio crackled as he called for backup. Within the hour, officers from 3 counties converged on Plainfield. They were looking for Bernice Worden, but what they were about to find would become the stuff of nightmares. Before we continue, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on those notifications, because here at Forbidden Visions, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the darkness that history tried to bury. And this one changed everything. The case of Ed Gein became the blueprint for every horror movie you've ever seen. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs. They all started here with one man, one farmhouse, and secrets so disturbing that even seasoned investigators couldn't speak about them for years. So subscribe, because you're going to want to see where this goes. To understand what happened on that farm, we need to go back, way back, to the beginning. August 27th, 1906, La Crosse County, Wisconsin. Edward Theodore Gein was born into a world of violence and religious fervor, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His father, George, was a broken man, an alcoholic, violent, unemployed more often than not. When George did interact with his sons, it was usually with his fists. He would beat young Ed and his older brother Henry with brutal regularity. Sometimes, George would strike Ed in the head so hard that the boy's ears would ring for hours afterward, a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. Ed learned early to stay quiet, to make himself small, to disappear into the corners of rooms. But George wasn't the problem. Augusta was. Augusta Wilhelmina Gein was a towering presence in that household, not physically, but psychologically. She dominated every aspect of her sons' lives with an iron grip wrapped in scripture. She was a devout Lutheran, fanatical, obsessive. In Augusta's worldview, humanity had fallen into sin. Modern society was corrupt. Women, especially, were instruments of Satan, temptresses, immoral, all of them, except her, of course. She was pure, righteous, the only moral woman in a world drowning in wickedness. She preached this to her sons every single day, sometimes for hours, her voice rising and falling like a fire and brimstone sermon. She told them that women wore makeup to seduce men, that short skirts and bobbed hair were signs of the apocalypse, that dancing, drinking, and laughter were pathways to hell. She forbade Ed and Henry from having friends, from socializing, from even speaking to girls. Any attempt Ed made to form a connection outside the family was met with fury. Augusta would scream in his face, spit flying, eyes wild with righteous anger. "You're going to hell. God sees everything. You're betraying me." Ed would cower, apologize, promise never to do it again, and he worshipped her for it. In Ed's mind, his mother wasn't cruel. She was protecting him, saving his soul. He loved her, feared her, obeyed her without question. She was the center of his entire universe. In 1914, when Ed was about 8 years old, the Gein family moved to a 155-acre farm outside Plainfield. It was remote, isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, perfect for Augusta, who wanted to shield her sons from the sinful world. The farmhouse itself was old, 2 stories, wooden, weathered by harsh Wisconsin winters. The property was surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place where sound didn't travel, where you could scream and no one would hear you. Ed and Henry were kept busy with endless chores, feeding livestock, repairing fences, hauling water. When they weren't working, Augusta homeschooled them. But it wasn't education. It was indoctrination. She would read passages from the Bible, from the book of Revelation, about sin, about punishment, about the eternal fires awaiting the wicked. Ed absorbed every word. At school, when he was allowed to attend, Ed was different. Classmates remembered him as shy, awkward. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was soft, almost childlike. But there was something else. Ed would laugh to himself, for no reason, sitting alone at his desk, staring at nothing, and suddenly he'd giggle, a quiet, unsettling sound. Teachers asked him what was funny. He never answered. One classmate later recalled, "It was like he was listening to someone we couldn't see, having a conversation with something, but no one intervened." This was the 1920s, small-town Wisconsin. You minded your own business. And Ed, he went home every day to that isolated farm, to his mother, to the only voice that mattered. As Ed grew into adolescence, his devotion to Augusta intensified. By the time he was a teenager, he had no friends, no hobbies, no life outside that farm. Other boys his age were interested in girls, in cars, in the world beyond Plainfield. Ed was interested only in his mother. Psychologists would later describe this as pathological enmeshment, an unhealthy, obsessive attachment that bordered on something deeply troubling. But Ed didn't see it that way. To him, his mother was perfect, pure, the only woman in the world worth loving, and Augusta reinforced this constantly. She told her sons that she was the only woman they would ever need, that all other women were corrupt, that love outside the family was sin. Ed believed her. In April 1940, George Gein died. Heart failure. He was 66 years old. For Ed, now 34, his father's death barely registered. George had been a shadow in that house. Violent, yes, but ultimately irrelevant. With George gone, Augusta's control over her sons tightened even further. But something was changing. Henry, Ed's older brother, was starting to question things. He would make comments. Quiet at first, then bolder. "Mom's not healthy for us, Ed. The way she talks about women, it's not normal. You need to get away from her. We both do." Ed recoiled at these words. They felt like blasphemy. His mother, unhealthy, impossible? Henry pressed on. He told friends in town that he was worried about Ed, that Ed's attachment to Augusta wasn't right, that it was twisted. And then, on May 16th, 1944, something happened. It was a warm spring afternoon. Ed and Henry were clearing brush on the farm. Controlled burns were common. You'd pile up dead vegetation and light it. Standard practice. But this fire got out of control. The wind shifted. Flames spread faster than expected. Smoke billowed across the property, thick and black, choking out the sky. According to Ed, he and Henry got separated in the chaos. Ed claimed he lost sight of his brother in the smoke, that he called out, searched, but couldn't find him. As the sun set and Henry still hadn't returned, Ed walked into town and reported his brother missing. Search parties were organized. Volunteers with flashlights combed the property. And here's where it gets strange. Ed led them directly to Henry's body. No hesitation, no wandering. He walked straight to a specific spot on the farm, as if he knew exactly where to look. Henry was lying face down on a patch of scorched earth. His clothes were singed, minor burns on his arms and hands, but nothing severe enough to cause death. The coroner examined the body, ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation, smoke inhalation combined with possible heart failure, accidental death. Case closed, but some of the men who'd been there that night noticed something. Henry had bruises on his head, blunt force trauma, marks that didn't match the story. One volunteer later said it looked like someone had struck him hard more than once, but no one pursued it. This was 1944, rural Wisconsin. The Geins were a quiet family. Ed was odd, sure, but harmless. The death was recorded as an accident. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened in that field. But Henry was dead, and now Ed had his mother all to himself. Augusta never recovered from Henry's death. Shortly after, she suffered a stroke. It left her partially paralyzed, weak, dependent. For the next year, Ed became her full-time caregiver. He bathed her, fed her, dressed her, carried her from room to room. For Ed, it was a strange kind of bliss. His mother needed him, only him. She couldn't leave, couldn't yell at him the way she used to. He had her completely. Augusta briefly recovered enough to leave the house. On one occasion, Ed took her to a neighbor's farm to buy straw. While they were there, something happened that disturbed Augusta deeply. The neighbor, in a fit of rage, beat his dog in front of them. The animal yelped and whined as the man struck it repeatedly with a piece of wood. A woman came running out of the house screaming at him to stop. Augusta was horrified, but not because of the animal cruelty. She was horrified by the woman. "Harlot!" Augusta screamed. "Living with a man in sin, unmarried." The woman was the neighbor's girlfriend. They weren't married. And to Augusta, that was a greater sin than beating a dog. Ed watched his mother tremble with righteous fury the entire ride home. It was the last time she left the farm. Shortly after, Augusta suffered a second stroke. This one was severe. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Wilhelmina Gein died. She was 67 years old. Ed was 39. And for the first time in his entire life, he was alone. The death of his mother shattered Ed Gein, not in the way grief normally breaks a person, not with tears or anger or even sadness. It broke something deeper, something fundamental. Ed's entire identity had been built around Augusta. She was his purpose, his moral compass, his world. Without her, he was nothing. He wandered through the farmhouse like a ghost. The rooms felt enormous, empty. The silence was suffocating. He couldn't sleep in his own bed, couldn't eat at the table, couldn't function. So he did the only thing that made sense to him. He preserved her. Ed boarded up Augusta's bedroom, sealed it shut. He did the same with the parlor, the room she used most often. Inside those rooms, everything stayed exactly as she'd left it. Her clothes hanging in the closet, her books stacked neatly on the nightstand, her bed made with hospital corners. The rest of the house, he let it rot. Dishes piled up in the sink, trash accumulated in corners, the wallpaper peeled, the floorboards warped. Ed moved into a small room adjacent to the kitchen. He slept on a cot surrounded by debris. But his mother's rooms, pristine, untouched, sacred. It was a shrine, and Ed was the devoted worshiper. In the years following Augusta's death, Ed's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He still did odd jobs around town, handyman work, fixing fences, repairing machinery. People paid him in cash or food. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, a little strange, maybe, but harmless. Some families even trusted him to babysit their children. Ed was good with kids, gentle, patient. He'd play games with them, tell them stories. No one suspected a thing. But at night, when Ed returned to that decaying farmhouse, something else was happening. He was reading, voraciously, books on anatomy, on death, on decomposition. He became obsessed with Nazi Germany, with the concentration camps, with medical experiments. He read about Josef Mengele, about atrocities, about the limits of human suffering. One figure particularly fascinated him, Ilse Koch, a concentration camp overseer. Rumors circulated after the war that Koch had made items from the remains of prisoners. The rumors were false, but Ed didn't know that, and the idea took root in his mind. Human remains, as material, as art, as something else. Ed later told psychiatrists that after his mother's death, he felt a force building inside him, a pressure, a need. He described it as a voice, not audible exactly, but a compulsion, an urge that grew stronger every day. He tried to ignore it, but the voice wouldn't stop. It told him things. You need another mother. She's out there, waiting. Bring her back. Ed subscribed to the local newspaper, the Plainfield Sun. Every week, he would turn to the obituaries. He studied them carefully, looking for names, ages, details. He was searching for women, middle-aged women, women who looked like Augusta. When he found a suitable candidate, he would note the date of the funeral, the location of the burial, and then he would wait. The first time Ed went to the cemetery, he wasn't sure he could go through with it. It was late, past midnight. The cemetery was deserted. He parked his truck on a dirt road about half a mile away, grabbed a shovel from the back, walked through the darkness. The grave was fresh, the soil still loose, easy to dig. Ed's hands trembled as he worked. His breath came in short gasps. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst, but he kept digging, down, 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 until the shovel struck wood. He cleared away the remaining dirt, pried open the coffin, and there she was, the woman from the obituary, pale, peaceful, dressed in her funeral clothes. Ed stared at her for a long time, and then, according to his later testimony, something happened. He blacked out. When he came to, he was back in his truck. The body was in the bed, wrapped in a tarp. He didn't remember taking her, didn't remember closing the coffin, didn't remember filling in the grave. It was like someone else had done it, but the body was there, and Ed brought her home. Over the next decade, Ed exhumed at least 9 bodies, maybe more. He would later claim that sometimes he would snap out of his trance halfway through and flee in terror. Other times, he would complete the task in a fugue state, only to wake up hours later surrounded by what he'd done, wondering how it happened. But conscious or not, the pattern continued. Ed brought the bodies back to the farmhouse, and there, in the privacy of that isolated property, he began his work. He later told investigators that he was trying to understand death, to study it, to reverse it somehow. But that wasn't the whole truth. Ed was trying to recreate his mother, not metaphorically, literally. He wanted to build her, to construct a woman from the remains of the deceased. And in his most disturbed fantasies, he wanted to become her. Ed told psychiatrists that he'd always felt wrong in his own body, that he wished he'd been born a woman, that he'd fantasized about medical procedures that could change him. But in the 1950s, in rural Wisconsin, that was impossible. So Ed found another way. He would create a woman's suit using preserved human tissue carefully treated. Ed began crafting clothing, a vest made from a female torso, gloves fashioned from human hands still articulated, leggings made from leg tissue, a mask made from an entire human face, complete with hair. He would wear these items, walk around the farmhouse at night, in the darkness, in the silence, pretending to be his mother, living out a fantasy so disturbed, so incomprehensible, that even decades later, psychologists struggled to fully explain it. Ed denied ever engaging in inappropriate acts with the bodies. They smelled too bad, he said, but everything else he did. The farmhouse became a workshop of horrors. In the kitchen, Ed kept jars of preserved organs, hearts, lungs, tissue samples floating in formaldehyde. In the living room, he had furniture covered in preserved human tissue, chairs, a footstool, the material smooth and pale. On the shelves, he displayed skulls, some whole, some modified into bowls and cups. He kept containers filled with disturbing collections of human remains that cannot be described in detail. He made items from preserved human tissue that defy explanation. He fashioned lampshades from treated human material. He had wastebaskets covered in preserved tissue, a sheath for a hunting knife made from treated remains, masks, so many masks, each one a different woman's face. And through it all, Ed maintained his routine. He did odd jobs in town, smiled at neighbors, acted like everything was normal. No one knew, no one suspected. The farmhouse kept its secrets. But grave robbing wasn't enough anymore. The bodies were old, decomposed, difficult to work with. Ed wanted something fresher. On December 8th, 1954, a woman named Mary Hogan disappeared. Mary was 51 years old. She ran a small tavern called Mary's Tavern about 6 miles outside Plainfield. She was a tough woman, independent, divorced. She'd moved to Wisconsin from Illinois a few years prior. Mary didn't serve just anyone, only regulars, people she knew. She kept a firearm behind the bar, just in case. On that December afternoon, a neighbor stopped by the tavern for a drink. The door was unlocked. The lights were on, but Mary wasn't there. The neighbor walked behind the bar. That's when he saw it. Blood, a pool of it on the wooden floor, drag marks leading to the back door. The cash register was open. empty, and on the floor, a spent cartridge. Mary Hogan had vanished. The disappearance of Mary Hogan became a local mystery. Police investigated. They interviewed regulars. They searched the surrounding area. Nothing. No body. No leads. No witnesses. The case went cold. But Ed made a strange comment to an acquaintance a few weeks later. They were talking about Mary's disappearance. The man said, "I wonder what happened to her." Ed smiled. A weird, lopsided smile. "She's not missing," he said. "She's at the farm right now." The man laughed it off, thought Ed was making a dark joke. He wasn't. 3 years later, Ed needed supplies. It was November 15th, 1957, a Friday. He drove into Plainfield, parked outside Worden's hardware store. Inside, Bernice Worden greeted him with a smile. Ed browsed the aisles, looked at tools, examined a rifle on display. Eventually, he approached the counter. "I'll take a gallon of antifreeze," he said. Bernice wrote out the receipt. Neat handwriting. Professional. "I'll pick it up tomorrow morning," Ed said. Bernice nodded. "It'll be ready." Ed left. The bell chimed as the door closed behind him. Bernice continued her work, unaware that she'd just written her own death warrant. The next morning, November 16th, 1957, Ed returned to the hardware store. It was early, just after opening. The street outside was quiet. Bernice was alone. Ed walked in. The bell chimed. He approached the counter. And then it happened. Ed later gave conflicting accounts of what transpired. In one version, he claimed he was examining a rifle when it accidentally discharged, striking Bernice. In another version, he admitted that he'd brought his own weapon, that he'd acted deliberately. Regardless of which story was true, the result was the same. Bernice Worden fell to the floor, deceased. Ed stood there for a moment, staring, and then the voice in his head took over. He moved quickly, dragged Bernice's body through the back door, loaded her into his truck. He took the money from the cash register, not because he needed it, but because it would look like a robbery. Then he drove home, back to the farm, back to his workshop. What Ed did to Bernice Worden's body is difficult to describe without violating content guidelines. But here's what investigators found. She'd been taken to the woodshed, suspended upside down from a ceiling beam by ropes tied around her ankles. She'd been decapitated. Her body had been treated the way a hunter would process a deer. It was systematic, methodical, practiced. This wasn't Ed's first time. When police arrived at the Gein farmhouse that evening, they didn't know what they'd find. They were hoping to locate Bernice, hoping she was still alive. Sheriff Art Schley led the search. He and several deputies approached the property cautiously. The farmhouse was dark, no lights, no movement. They checked the main house first, found nothing. Then they moved to the woodshed. One deputy shined his flashlight inside, and then he screamed. What the police found in that woodshed would traumatize them for the rest of their lives. Bernice Worden's body suspended like meat in a processing facility. Her pale, bloodless form, the modifications that had been made, the smell. God, the smell. One officer became physically ill immediately. Another collapsed, hyperventilating. Sheriff Schley forced himself to stay calm, to process the scene. But this was just the beginning. Inside the farmhouse, investigators discovered a nightmare. In the kitchen, human skulls modified into bowls, organs in jars, preserved tissue in containers on the stove. In the living room, furniture covered in treated human material, a chair with components made from human bones. In the bedroom, boxes filled with preserved human remains, collections that cannot be described in detail. On the walls, masks made from human faces. Some still had hair attached. In the closet, a full woman's suit, components fashioned from preserved human tissue, Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack, Mary Hogan's skull fashioned into a decorative piece, containers with disturbing collections of preserved remains, items fashioned from treated human tissue, lampshades made from processed human material, gloves made from preserved human hands, multiple facial remains, and so much more. Sheriff Art Schley, a veteran law enforcement officer, stood in the middle of that farmhouse and wept. He'd seen crime scenes before, incidents, violence, but nothing like this, nothing close to this. One deputy radioed headquarters, his voice shaking. "You need to see this. You need to. I can't even just get everyone here. Now." Word spread quickly. Within hours, reporters from across the country descended on Plainfield. The sleepy town of 642 people became the center of the most sensational crime story in American history. Newspaper headlines screamed, "House of Horrors, Wisconsin ghoul arrested, most disturbing crime scene ever discovered." Photographers tried to get pictures of the farmhouse. The police blocked them, but details leaked anyway. The nation was horrified and fascinated. Ed Gein was arrested at a grocery store in Plainfield on the evening of November 16th. He didn't resist, didn't run. When officers approached him, he simply nodded. "I figured you'd come for me," he said. They took him into custody. At the police station, Ed confessed almost immediately. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as if describing a carpentry project. "I was responsible for Mrs. Worden's death," he said. "It was an accident. I was looking at a rifle in the store, and it went off." When pressed, he admitted that he'd taken her body home, that he'd processed it. "Like a deer," he said. He also confessed to being responsible for Mary Hogan's death. "That one I remember better," he said. "I shot her in the tavern, took her home." Investigators asked about the other remains, the skulls, the preserved tissue. Ed explained about the grave robbing, about the 9 bodies he'd exhumed over the years. He told them about the woman's suit, about wearing it, about pretending to be his mother. He showed no emotion, no remorse. It was as if he didn't understand that what he'd done was wrong. Sheriff Art Schley sat across from Ed during one interrogation. He'd been up for 36 hours. He couldn't get the images out of his head. Bernice Worden in that shed, the masks on the walls, the furniture made from human remains. Schley snapped. He lunged across the table, grabbed Ed by the collar, slammed his head into the brick wall. Once, twice, 3 times. Other officers pulled him off. Ed slumped in his chair, dazed. Blood trickled from his scalp, but he didn't fight back. He just looked at Schley with those empty eyes. "I understand," Ed said quietly. "I know what I did was bad." Schley left the room, locked himself in a bathroom, and sobbed. Because of the violence during interrogation, Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible, but it didn't matter. Ed repeated his story to multiple investigators, willingly, without coercion. There was no doubt about his guilt. The question was his sanity. Psychiatrists examined Ed extensively. They diagnosed him with schizophrenia, severe psychosis, possible dissociative identity disorder. Ed told doctors that he heard voices, that something compelled him. "After my mother died," he said, "I felt empty. I needed to fill that emptiness. I needed another mother." He described the grave robbing in detail, how he would black out, how he'd wake up surrounded by what he'd done, unsure how it happened. He talked about the woman's suit, his desire to become female, to literally wear his mother's identity. "I wanted to be inside her presence," he said. The psychiatrists were horrified. One doctor noted, "This is one of the most disturbed individuals I've ever examined. His attachment to his mother was pathological to an extreme degree. His crimes were an attempt to resurrect her and to become her." Ed was declared legally insane, unfit to stand trial. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. He would remain there for the next decade. In the hospital, Ed was a model patient. He was polite, cooperative. He participated in therapy. He even took up hobbies, painting, stone polishing. He made little artworks, landscapes, abstract pieces. The staff liked him. If you didn't know what he'd done, one nurse later said, you'd think he was just a shy, harmless old man. But they knew. They all knew. In 1968, after 10 years in the mental hospital, doctors determined that Ed had stabilized enough to stand trial. His condition had improved with medication and therapy. He was deemed competent. The trial began in November 1968. Given Ed's notoriety, his defense team requested a trial without jury. They argued that it would be impossible to find an impartial jury. The judge agreed. The trial lasted 1 week. Psychiatrists testified. Crime scene photographs were entered into evidence. Ed's confessions were read aloud. The outcome was never in doubt. On November 14, 1968, Judge Robert H. Goldmar delivered his verdict. Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. But in a separate phase to determine sanity, the judge concluded that Ed was not guilty by reason of insanity. He would not go to prison. Instead, he would return to the mental hospital for the rest of his life. Some in Plainfield were outraged. He should face the ultimate punishment, they said. He should suffer like his victims suffered. But the law was the law. Ed returned to Central State Hospital, and there he remained. For the next 16 years, Ed Gein lived quietly in the psychiatric facility. He painted. He polished stones. He read books. He rarely spoke about his crimes. When asked, he would say things like, "I don't know why I did it. Something inside me was broken." He never expressed remorse. Not really. Not in the way that suggests he truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done. In 1984, Ed's health began to decline. He developed cancer. His respiratory system was failing. On July 26, 1984, at 1:16 p.m., Ed Gein died. He was 77 years old. Cause of death, respiratory failure due to lung cancer and heart disease. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in the family plot, next to his mother, Augusta, and his brother, Henry. Over the years, Ed Gein's grave became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious. People would visit, take photos, but mostly they vandalized it. Souvenir hunters chipped away pieces of the headstone, little by little, year after year. In 2000, the entire headstone was stolen. Today, Ed Gein lies in an unmarked grave, just dirt, grass, a small metal marker with a number. Only cemetery staff know exactly where he's buried. The legacy of Ed Gein extends far beyond that unmarked grave. In 1960, author Robert Bloch published Psycho. The character of Norman Bates was directly inspired by Ed Gein. When Alfred Hitchcock adapted the novel into a film, it became one of the most iconic horror movies ever made. In 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre featured Leatherface, who wears masks made of human material. Inspired by Ed Gein. In 1988, Thomas Harris published The Silence of the Lambs. Buffalo Bill was based on Ed Gein. Ed didn't just commit crimes. He created a template for fictional horror that's been copied for over 6 decades. But here's what disturbs me most. Ed Gein wasn't born evil. He was profoundly damaged, a product of extreme isolation, religious indoctrination, and pathological attachment. In another life, with help, Ed might have been normal. That's what makes it so unsettling. It wasn't inevitable. Let me tell you about Bernice Worden's son, Frank. For 37 years, he carried the knowledge of how his mother died. He'd never married, never had children. Friends said he became withdrawn, haunted. He would wake up in the middle of the night, the same nightmare every time, opening that shed door, seeing his mother there, knowing he was too late to save her. In his final years, Frank developed dementia. He would have moments of clarity, moments where he'd remember, and he would weep. "I should have stopped him," he'd say. "I knew Ed was strange. I should have checked sooner." But how could he have known? How could anyone have known? Frank Warden died in 1994. He was 81 years old. Some say he never truly recovered from that November day in 1957. Mary Hogan's family never got closure. Her body was so thoroughly dismembered that they couldn't give her a proper burial. Parts of her remained missing, lost in the chaos of the crime scene investigation. Her daughter, who was in her early 20s when Mary disappeared, struggled for years afterward, the not knowing. The 3 years between her mother's disappearance and the discovery of what happened. The hope that maybe, somehow, Mary was still alive. And then the truth, which was so much worse than any theory they'd imagined. Mary's daughter died in 1983 from complications related to substance use. She was 49 years old. Some say she never recovered from learning how her mother died. Mary Hogan has no memorial today. Her tavern was demolished decades ago. She's largely forgotten, except in the context of Ed Gein's crimes. Her life reduced to a footnote in a horror story. Sheriff Art Schley, the man who slammed Ed's head into the wall, never recovered either. The images from the Gein farmhouse haunted him for the rest of his life. He developed severe PTSD. He couldn't sleep. He'd wake up screaming. He started drinking heavily. In 1968, just a few months after Ed's trial, Art Schley died of a heart attack. He was 54 years old. His widow later said, "That case took his life. He was never the same after that night. Never." Several other officers who worked the Gein case developed psychological issues afterward. Nightmares, anxiety, substance problems. One officer quit law enforcement entirely, moved out of state, never spoke about it again. The trauma rippled outward, touching everyone who came in contact with the case. In 2006, researchers interviewed elderly Plainfield residents who remembered Ed. One woman, now in her 80s, recalled Ed babysitting her when she was a child. "He was nice to me," she said. "He let me stay up late. He told me stories. He made me hot chocolate." She paused, her eyes distant. "And then I found out what he'd done, and I realized I'd been in that house. I'd sat in that living room with him, with those things." She shuddered. "I still have nightmares. Do you want to know something that keeps me up at night?" Ed Gein babysat children. Multiple families in Plainfield trusted him with their kids. He would watch them, play with them, put them to bed in that farmhouse, surrounded by human remains. The masks on the walls, the furniture made from treated tissue, the skulls on the shelves. The children didn't know, but they were there, in the same space as those horrors. One woman who was babysat by Ed in the early 1950s was interviewed in 2004. She was in her 60s by then. She said, "I have this memory. I must have been 6 or 7. I was at Ed's house. I needed to use the bathroom. I remember walking down the hallway, and I tried to open a door, but it was boarded up. I asked Ed why. He just smiled and said, 'That's my mother's room. No one goes in there.' Even as a kid, I thought it was weird, but I didn't question it." She paused. Years later, after everything came out, I realized what else was in that house while I was there. What did I walk past without knowing? She shook her head. I'll never have an answer, and that's what haunts me. Ed Gein's story raises uncomfortable questions about mental illness, about responsibility, about the nature of evil. Was Ed Gein insane? Yes, clearly. Was he responsible for his actions? Legally, no. Morally, that's harder to answer. He was shaped by forces beyond his control, an abusive father, a fanatical mother, extreme isolation. But he still made choices. He chose to dig up those graves. He chose to take the lives of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He chose to create those horrific objects. Even in the grip of mental illness, there were moments of clarity, moments where he knew it was wrong, but he did it anyway. One psychiatrist who evaluated Ed noted something chilling. He said, "Ed Gein is the most dangerous type of mentally ill person, not because he's violent in the traditional sense, but because he doesn't understand the boundaries between life and death, between person and object. He looked at human bodies the way you or I might look at lumber, as raw materials. That complete absence of empathy, combined with his delusions, it created a perfect recipe for horror." During a therapy session, Ed was asked, "Do you feel bad about what you did to those women?" Ed thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I feel bad that people are upset. I didn't mean to upset anyone." The psychiatrist pressed, "But what about the women? Bernice Worden, Mary Hogan, the others whose bodies you took?" Ed looked confused. "They were already deceased," he said. "I didn't hurt them. They were gone." He genuinely didn't understand. In his mind, the deceased weren't people anymore. They were materials, resources. He couldn't comprehend why that was wrong. In 1968, during Ed's trial, the judge asked him a question. "Mr. Gein, do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Ed thought for a long moment. "People are upset," he said finally. "I upset people. That was wrong. But do you understand that you took 2 lives? That you desecrated human remains?" Ed looked confused. "I don't think I caused Mrs. Worden's death intentionally," he said. "The weapon discharged. It was an accident. And the bodies you dug up? The things you made from them?" Ed shrugged. "They were already deceased," he said. "I didn't hurt them." The judge sat back, shook his head. There was no reaching him. Ed Gein existed in a reality separate from everyone else, and in that reality, he'd done nothing wrong. In 1981, a young psychology student named Sarah visited Ed at the hospital. She was writing her thesis on criminal psychology. She sat across from Ed in a small interview room. He was years old, frail. His hands shook. She asked him standard questions about his childhood, his mother, his crimes. Ed answered in his usual vague, detached way. And then Sarah asked something different. "If you could go back," she said, "if you could change one thing in your life, what would it be?" Ed thought for a long time. Minutes passed. Finally, he spoke. "I wish my mother hadn't died," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "Because then you wouldn't have done those things?" "No," Ed said. He looked at her with those empty eyes. "Because I miss her." Sarah realized in that moment that Ed still didn't get it. Even after decades of therapy, of medication, of treatment, he still didn't understand. He wasn't sorry for the crimes. He was sorry his mother was gone. That was the only thing that mattered to him. Today, Plainfield is still a small town. About 900 people now. Tourists occasionally visit, looking for locations from the Gein case. The locals don't like to talk about it. If you ask directions to where the farmhouse stood, they'll tell you they don't know, even though they do. The land where the Gein farm once stood is privately owned now. Unremarkable, empty, except for trees and grass. There's no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history once existed there. The town wants to forget, but they can't. Every few years, a new movie comes out, a new documentary, a new book, and Plainfield is back in the news. The town where Ed Gein committed his crimes, the house of horrors. It never ends. The Plainfield hardware store where Bernice Worden was taken no longer exists. It was torn down In the 1980s, a small park sits there now. A memorial plaque honors Bernice, beloved mother, respected businesswoman, taken too soon. But most people who pass by don't stop to read it. They don't know the story. Or maybe they've forgotten. Have you ever driven through rural Wisconsin? It's beautiful. Rolling hills, dense forests, small towns scattered across the landscape, places where everyone knows everyone, where life moves slowly. But there's something else there too, an isolation, a remoteness, farmhouses miles from the nearest neighbor, roads that lead nowhere, woods that swallow sound. It's easy to imagine secrets hiding in places like that, things that stay buried because no one's around to see. Ed Gein's farmhouse was one of those places, 7 miles outside Plainfield, down dirt roads, surrounded by trees. You could scream there and no one would hear you. You could do unspeakable things and no one would know. For 10 years, that's exactly what happened. I want you to imagine something. Imagine being a police officer, a small-town sheriff in 1957. You've dealt with minor crimes, petty theft, bar fights, and then, one night, you get a call. A woman is missing. You need to check a local man's farm. You arrive. The property is dark, silent. You search the grounds with your flashlight. You open a shed door, and you see that. How do you process it? How do you go home to your family that night and pretend everything is normal? You can't. The trauma changes you forever. Here's what is true. In November 1957, 2 police officers were inside the Gein farmhouse photographing evidence. One of them heard a creaking sound from upstairs. Ed was in custody. No one else should be in the house. They drew their weapons, climbed the stairs slowly. The sound was coming from Augusta's sealed bedroom. One officer approached, put his ear to the door. He heard breathing, slow, steady. Something was in that room. He kicked the door open. Wood splintered. Inside, Augusta's room was exactly as Ed had left it, pristine, untouched. But the room was empty. No one there. The breathing had stopped. The officer stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, and then he felt it, a cold draft wrapping around him. He stumbled backward, down the stairs. He never went back. To this day, he swears something was in that room, something that didn't want to leave. Ed Gein died in 1984, but some people believe he never really left that farmhouse. There are stories, rumors. People who visited the land where the farm stood report strange things, sounds in the woods, whispers, the feeling of being watched. One paranormal investigation team visited in 2012. They set up equipment, cameras, audio recorders. At 3:33 a.m., every piece of equipment malfunctioned simultaneously. Cameras shut off, batteries drained, audio filled with static, and in the static, a voice. "Mother," it said, over and over. "Mother, mother, mother." The team packed up and left. They never returned. So here's what I want you to think about tonight. When you're lying in bed, in the dark, trying to sleep, think about Ed Gein, not as a monster, not as a movie villain, but as a real person, a lonely, damaged man who lived in a decaying farmhouse and couldn't let go of his dead mother, a man who did things so horrible that they redefined our understanding of human depravity, a man who walked through town, smiled at neighbors, babysat children, while his home contained the remains of at least 11 people. He was real. The crimes were real. The horror was real. And here's the terrifying part. For 10 years, no one knew. No one suspected. Ed Gein hid in plain sight. And if he could do it, who else could? How many people do you pass every day who seem normal? How many neighbors, co-workers, strangers on the street, looking ordinary, acting ordinary, but hiding something dark, something unspeakable? Ed Gein proved that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else. If this story made you look over your shoulder, hit that like button and subscribe to Forbidden Visions. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we uncover the darkness that history tried to bury. Drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think Ed Gein was insane? Or was he evil? Can someone be both? Have you ever met someone who seemed normal, but something about them felt wrong? I read every comment, and I want to hear your thoughts, because Ed Gein's story isn't just about one man. It's about how disturbed individuals hide among us, looking normal, acting normal, until one day they're not. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors tonight. And remember, the real horror isn't in the movies, it's in the history books. I'll see you in the next one, if you dare.